Alright, hello people, this is New Sensei. Thank you for your patience. We have another topic today, and something which just popped up. This was a thread on Reddit. It was linked on the archery subreddit. It's actually from the who would win subreddit, and I thought this was quite an interesting scenario, and I think a lot of people would like to play around with this concept of this versus that, or who would win. Again, we have this a certain romantic idea of what the past was like, and sometimes we can overrate certain elements. So what I'm looking at today is the topic of modern versus medieval archers, and I'll show you the thread. So what will happen is I'll talk about the thread and the question. I'll provide my assessment and evaluation of the matchup, and then we'll take some questions and comments at the end. So I will show you the thread, and that's from Reddit. You can see the link there. So the thread is on who would win. It is from Behind the Burner 32, and the question is: archers in a medieval army are replaced by 300 modern archers. How would that army fare? Would nothing change, or would modern bows and arrows, along with the elite training, make a difference in battle? Assume that the archers have been briefed as to what timeline they are in and who they are dealing with, and are stocked with enough arrows for a 30-day campaign. Bonus: how fearsome would a modern archer be if he or she became an assassin? Now, I actually wrote a very long response, as you can see here. That's probably the most popular response right now. However, I seem to have misread the question, because the question's asking how would the army fare with modern archers rather than medieval archers. I think that is a very interesting question, but I'll save that for a different video. Instead, what I did was assume that this was an archer versus archer matchup. So let's say 300 medieval archers versus 300 modern archers. And I think that will be a much more interesting interpretation of the question. And again, I will cover the the actual question a different time, because that too has interesting ramifications. But our scenario is 300 medieval archers versus 300 modern archers. Now, there are immediate problems with this scenario. The first thing we have to do is to define what the archers actually are. When we talk about medieval archers, I think the majority of us will be thinking of the English longbowmen, and for good reason too. The English longbowmen were the dominant archery force in Western Europe during the Middle Ages, and there were many reasons why. So the English longbowmen were feared, not just because the weapon itself was really good, but because the entire realm was basically economized and galvanized to be a pool of manpower ready to become military archers. So by law, people had to train, and that meant that lords and the king ultimately could draw on a corps of archers, and they could maintain a small standing army of archers. Archers are one of the more specialized combat forces, because they required specialized equipment, specialized training. So when we think about, again, medieval, we think English longbows, but they weren't the only types of archers in the Middle Ages. You would have many other kinds of archers which weren't English longbowmen. You would think about, say, Eastern Europe, for example, or the Central Asian peoples who, during the same time, would be using horse bows and fighting on horseback archery, and so on. But for the simplicity of this topic, and this was the intent in the thread, we're gonna basically combine all the medieval style styles into one archetype. And I'm going to say that for the sake of this comparison, we're going to talk about a medieval foot archer. If you think English longbow, okay, we'll think English longbows, but let's say a generic foot archer using a war bow, so a bow that is actually used in war, that has the right draw weight and equipment to fight in war. So that's the medieval side. The other side is the modern archer, and that too requires a more specific definition. Now, the problem with a modern archer is that we don't have modern archers. Archery was phased out long ago. Archers today are basically athletes or people doing archery as a hobby, or people doing archery for bow hunting. Apart from that, there are no current applications for a bow and arrow. So if we're going to look at this from a medieval army versus modern athletes, that's gonna be a pretty one-sided battle. So I'm not going to talk about Olympic archery. In fact, I'm not going to talk about recurve bows at all, because recurve bows are basically bows with modern materials and sights and stabilizers. These would not be practical in the field, in the scenarios given in this matchup. So for the fun of having a matchup, what I would like to do, sorry, just reading a comment there. Hey, someone's spamming me. Yeah, what I would like to do is think about modern archery in the extreme. So instead of looking at recurve bows, let's look at something which is uniquely a modern idea, and that's the compound bow. Most people know what compound bows are, but for those who are watching who are new to archery and don't know, a compound bow, which I don't have here with me, but I'm going to use this as my prop. So this is a mini compound bow. This is actually a functional bow. The idea of a compound bow is that you have a modern material. You have typically aluminium metal riser and limbs, or you might have wood core. But for the most part, it's a metal bow. But more importantly, it has cams and pulleys, so that it is a much more efficient bow. So you can have a very high velocity shot for a much more compact bow, thanks to these inventions. So there are certain advantages which a compound user would have. If you're assuming modern items, then they will definitely have a sight. The sight will probably be magnified, so they can adjust the sight and actually have a good view. The other thing to consider is that they would probably have a release aid. For those who are new, that's a trigger mechanism. So that means they don't have to, they're less prone to making errors with the release with their fingers. The third thing to note is that the compound bow has a function called a let-off. That means when you pull the compound bow back, the cams will basically lock in place, and it will hold the weight of the bow for you. Now, this is a 12-pound mini compound, but I'm holding like 2 pounds on my fingers. There's really no weight here. If with a modern compound, it's possible to drop the let-off down to even like 95%. So it is, like, to be realistic, if you shot say a 60 or 70-pound compound and you held it back at full draw like I just did, then you would be holding around maybe 15 to 20 pounds. That's a very, very light weight. In contrast, someone shooting a 180-pound warbow is holding 180 pounds at full draw. So you can't hold a warbow at full draw for more than a second. You basically have to do the shot right away. So when you consider the technological advantages of a compound bow, things get kind of interesting. They actually get really, really interesting. That's why this matchup isn't going to be a one-sided, or of course the longbowman will win, because yeah, modern bows are designed for precision, accuracy, and performance in the sporting environment or hunting environment. But in actual practice, if we were to hypothetically place a core of trained bowmen using compound bows, how would things differ? And that's where things get really interesting. So Um, what I'm going to think about in this case is different ways in which the archers would have an edge over each other. So I'm going to talk about the tilt factors, the edge. Think about like Deadliest Warrior sort of thing here, right? So let's think about the again. We just mentioned for the modern archer. You do have like modern archers don't shoot the same high draw weights as medieval archers. But remember that draw weight isn't everything. Draw weight as a number is often used in the same way where, you know, the weightlifters will talk about lifting weights and bigger is better. That's not necessarily the case. Right? For archers, it's often velocity. So because modern archers will shoot metal arrows, which is inconceivable for a medieval archer, shooting aluminium arrows or carbon arrows. Good grief, carbon, where did that come from? Carbon in medieval times is for coal, and that's basically it. So yeah, you would have a very big advantage in material. So I'm gonna turn my phone off for a moment because people are bugging me right now. That is really cool too, but I'll leave it off for now. Yeah, the thing with modern compound is that you project arrows very, very quickly. You often have a much flatter trajectory, and in a way you do have a higher maximum range. I believe the world record for compound fly archery is over a kilometer, or nearly there, so it's really long. Now, this isn't effective range, and this comes to factor a bit later in my discussion. So you have a piece of equipment which is very accurate because the way the bow is designed, it's going to push it very quickly. You have sight, you have a let off, and you have a release aid. So you're going to have a very high level of base consistency. If you put a compound bow in a machine, it should shoot exactly on that dot, on that X every single time. A longbow, on the other hand, will not inherently have that accuracy. As much as we want to romanticize medieval archery and longbows and all that, they do not shoot anywhere near as accurately. This is partly user, this is partly the bow itself. If you want to see more of this evidence, yesterday I did a live stream comparing longbow and barebow world records alongside Olympic recurve and compound records. The reality of the matchup is that longbows are nowhere near as accurate, not even close. If we're thinking competition, which is an unfair match, then you know, a longbow shooter, if you shoot like 6 arrow ends, a longbow shooter might drop 20 points for those 6 arrows. A compound shooter will drop 20 points over the entire day. That's the quality and accuracy of a typical compound shooter. So that's one edge that a modern archer has, a very big edge, is they're going to be a lot more accurate. In addition, it's much easier for someone to learn to use a compound bow. Again, you just need to learn the basics of archery, and you have to shoot. And even a novice compound archer should get good groupings in a very short amount of time. That's the reason why compound bows are very popular with most shooters. I'd say most archers these days, apart from the traditional archers, most modern archers will go compound. There is a much bigger market and it's more accessible. Recurve requires more training and dedication. So that's one advantage which will play later on. Now the longbow, just going back to the longbow or the medieval bow, typically a medieval bow will have more draw weight. You would expect a bit more performance against armor. That said, arrows are generally not good against armored targets. Even against mail and gambeson, it's not going to penetrate most of the time. So we're not going to factor in armor as a thing here. But the longbows or the warbows generally do have a much higher rate of fire. And even with compounds, because the compound bow is a delicate system, it does take a bit more care to load and pull back. Otherwise, you will derail the bow and you can't fix it in the field. When you think about why compound bows aren't used in military applications today, it's not a robust weapon. With a longbow, you can just drop the bow on the ground and it's just a stick. It's fine. It'll be okay. With a compound, you might break an accessory. There are moving parts. You need to you have to maintain it. But again, in a combat environment, it's a lot harder to use correctly. So it's a bit more finicky, I guess. Yeah, that's a word, fickle. So that is one consideration. By the way, you will see compound bows in pop culture references, like in Rambo, in Crisis, and in Tomb Raider. So it does have some function, and there is a reason why compound bows are often more used in these pop culture games and movies. But again, the longbow's main advantage is that it has a lot more power behind it, and this is partly because the bow is high draw weight, and also because the arrow is a bit heavier. The arrows are designed to penetrate armor as much as possible, so it probably will have more kinetic energy behind the arrow. And again, a faster rate of fire. So those are the pieces that we have right now. Sorry for the confusion there, but I'm just trying to lay it out in my head. So the pieces are compound, modern archer, compound, faster weapon, more accurate, easy to use. Whereas the longbow, you generally have a more, it's used in longer distances. For different reasons. It will probably have more power behind it, and will generally shoot faster because you don't have to be careful in loading. You basically knock and loose, and that's your shot process. So that's what we're up against. So if this was the scenario, then what would be the likely outcome? I'm going to take a bit of a break here. I'll let the people chat for a bit. I'm not sure if you have anything else to ask. At the moment, there doesn't seem any questions. That's okay. We'll come back to questions a bit later. All right. So where was I? So all right. So what I have, what I typed up in the thread, it's probably right. I'll follow my my points in my Reddit thread here. So the heart of the question is really, is it about a civilian versus a soldier? If that's the case, the soldier will win. But assuming that the people are equal, they're not civilians, they're trained to use bows in war. So what would happen if you had an archer with a modern compound bow, or sorry, a force of archers using modern compound bows versus a force of medieval archers? That's the question. So this is how I would break it down. If this was purely a test of accuracy, then the modern compound user will win hands down. If this was a shooting tournament, if instead of having a war, the archers decide to have a shoot-off in in the Middle Ages, and someone brought a compound bow, there will be no competition. The compound bow will make a mockery. And this is the thing, right? For a medieval archer, the compound bow would be a weapon of the gods. It would be so insanely powerful. Like, to us in a modern time, when someone sees a compound bow, it's like using a laser. Imagine like a medieval person seeing a compound bow and not knowing what a laser was. That's basically like a god, like someone throwing a lightning bolt at a target. It would be faster than what the eye could see, and they would be bedazzled. So in a pure test of accuracy, the compound bow will always win. Probably blindfold too. It is so unbalanced that this would be like if you didn't patch Overwatch and Hanzo was overpowered. Probably still is. But yeah, so in pure accuracy, then the compound bow has the edge. Now, when we start thinking about if they were facing off against each other, we have some interesting scenarios here. Okay, let's say we have a one-on-one. I think one of the ways we'll talk about this is one-on-one. So we have a one medieval archer against one modern compound archer. If this was the case, again, it really depends on the actual scenario. If you consider that, I'm going to make one assumption. The medieval archer probably has first shot initiative. It takes less time for a medieval archer or a longbow shooter to pick up a bow and arrow and shoot. Basically, you pick it up, bang, you shoot. Compound takes a bit more delicate movement, so you have to knock the arrow, place on the rest, and then pull it back, let the let off kick in, look down the sight, look at the peep sight, pull the trigger. It takes more steps to shoot a compound accurately. So the longbowman does have a slight advantage in that they can probably shoot first. That said, the first shot accuracy is going to be in favor of the compound shooter. I'm going to demonstrate something here. Now, we don't talk about live targets or human targets in archery, but I want to make a point. So, what I have here is a target center. This is the center of an 80 centimeter target, and the actual diameter of the 10 ring is about 8 centimeters. So, again, we're assuming elite soldiers here, so fully trained, have very good accuracy. Alright, so if you look at the world record for compound, this is what they shoot at 50 meters. And I believe the record, I'm going to double check this. I did this yesterday, by the way. But the record, I'm just going to quickly Google this. Just give me a moment, guys. Reords, so type it correctly. Records, world archery records. Again, this is what I talked about yesterday's live stream. I'm going to show you the record for this target. So let's have a quick look here. I think I found it. Yes. Okay. All right. I'm going to flip over to Firefox now. So the record here, you can see, for 50 meters, 72 arrows, with a compound bow, this is the size of a target at 50 meters. And this big ring here is 10 points. So everything inside here is 10 points. This yellow out here is 9 points. Sorry, let's try that again with the correct camera. Alright, so the center here is 10 points, including the X and the small circle. That's 10 points. The outer gold is 9 points. Okay, now if we go back to the world records, back to Firefox, there we go. So if we see the world record for Braden Galanthian, American shooter, at 50 meters on this target, he scored 718 out of 720. What that means is that at 50 meters, he only shot outside this circle twice. That's what it means. So that's 2 points away from a perfect score. That means 2 arrows out of 72 were outside that inner circle twice. Now, of course, in a combat situation, you're not going to shoot with that level of precision and consistency, but that is the level of accuracy and precision a compound bow can achieve. Now, if we were to overlay this on a human target, well, firstly, this is about the size of my head, isn't it, right? So I don't have a very big head, but that's basically the head size. But obviously, in combat, you're probably aiming at center of mass. So look at center of mass. That's a 50-meter target on a body. Now, obviously, a body is going to be a lot bigger than this. And for someone who can, an elite shooter, who can hit this target 100% of the time at 50 meters, and the inner target, 99% of the time, even on a bad shot, you're going to hit something in the body. Now, not all hits will be lethal, but this is one of the crucial things I want to show you, is this is the standard of modern compound at 50 meters. You extend this to 70 meters or 90 meters, it will still hit this gold probably 90% of the time, if not more. So it is a very accurate weapon. We call it a weapon. It's very, very accurate. And even on a bad shot, a compound shooter will still hit like a 9 or an 8 on a target. So a bad shot will still hit center of mass. It's why you aim at center of mass. So that's one of the big things I want to point out here, is that there is a very, very high first shot accuracy. and that's proven by the world records we just saw. Now again, combat situation, it won't be as consistent, but you can probably assume that there is going to be a very high chance the compound shooter will hit what they're aiming at in that distance, and distance will be a factor in this discussion. So with medieval versus modern, one-on-one, if the medieval archer does not get a hit on the first shot, it is very likely that the compound shooter will hit on their return shot. So it depends on who gets it first, if the medieval misses or not. That's the real thing. Now, once we start escalating the numbers into more like a skirmish or a battlefield situation, things get a bit more interesting, because now we have to factor in the combat environment. So this is what I've broken it down to. In my opinion, I think the breakdown goes as follows. So I'm just going to read off my notes here. So the first thing I said before is, if this was a test of accuracy, the modern compound bow will always win. For first shot accuracy, the modern compound bow will probably win, and the arrow will probably reach a target first. So if they shot at the same time, the compound will win. Where things get interesting is when we start thinking about battlefield scenarios. So a medieval archer will typically shoot faster, and they can engage in a much further effective range. Now, while both bows can shoot at long distance, and more so for the compound bow is really designed for precision in that mid-range. You can shoot accurately up to 100+ meters, but most archers don't, and you really don't want to shoot at a target you can barely see. However, medieval archers could fire indirectly in volleys. If not volleys, then at least high arcing fire, high angle shots. That was one of the ways archers in medieval times used their bows, especially in formations. A compound archer can do so. You can shoot clout if you want to do so, but they're not as good. It's basically you're randomly shooting arrows in the air. It's very hard to range a compound shot. So one of the things which you'll see is that a medieval formation will probably have a huge advantage over a compound force at distance. Let's say above 100 meters, then a compound, a medieval unit will barrage that unit. Basically, archers in the medieval times were equivalent to artillery. So you would continually shoot and harass and suppress the enemy at a long distance. Now for melee units, you would have to close the distance, and that's very hard to do when you're being pelted by arrows. Even if you're wearing armor, you're being hit by what would be giant hailstones, and if you look up, you probably hit the eye. So it's very, very hard for a unit to close distance. So if we were to engage at a long distance skirmish, the compound shooters would probably not have an effective shot, whereas the medieval shooters would probably be happily barraging the bejesus out of the compound shooters. They might just win it there and then. Now, if the combat were to close distance to about 100 meters, let's say 50 to 100 meters, or let's say the battlefield was only that large, or maybe they only encountered each other at this distance, then things become very different. Now, the problem with a medieval formation is that an individual archer could not mark their own target at long distance. They would have to follow a volley controlled by the master archer or the captain of the unit, and they would make a very general thing. So they could still volley at, let's say, 70 meters, but the arrows become, the arrows, some will miss, some will hit, some will land short, some will land far, and so on. It's your typical average spread. But what happens with the compound archers is that every compound archer now becomes basically a rifleman, or a sniper, but only at, like, say, 50 to 100 meters. So instead of having to wait for someone to call the shot and call the rhythm, every archer is now an autonomous marksman. This is kind of similar to musket fire compared to rifleman fire or light infantry. So every compound shooter would mark their own target, they would estimate their own range, and even if the estimates are off, there is a very, very high chance of a hit with return fire. So instead of having, let's say, 300 arrows volleying towards a formation, you have 300 compound shooters, each marking an individual archer to shoot at. That is going to be devastating. Even if not all of them hit, again, think about battlefield. If some arrows miss, and let's say we have 80% hit rate or 70% hit rate, very likely of compound, then you would see absolute devastation in the medieval ranks. But like I said before, if a medieval archer saw what a compound bow could do, it's like seeing a god throw a lightning bolt. And you would see like the first rank of medieval shooters just have pins stuck in them and they'd fall back. Now, would this be lethal? Depends on the arrows used, but let's say you have the appropriate head. You might use a broad head, you might have a specialized armor piercing point, who knows. But point is, the archers get hit. And in my opinion, I think the first shot for the compound would decimate the medieval archers. Now, the longer this goes, the more it swings in favor of the medieval archer, because they can sustain a higher rate of fire than the compound shooter. But the compound shooter can shoot more accurately, but slower. So it's a match between volume of fire and all the suppression that comes with it, compared to the precision marksmanship of the compound shooter. Now, if things get even closer, if you get to within, say, 40 meters or 30 meters, you're nearly at melee range, then the advantage goes back to the longbowman. While at close distance, a compound shooter should be able to hit 100% of their shots, they still have the problem of the rate of fire. The longbowman is able to hit a man-sized target at this distance. That's what they're trained for. And at close distances, they stop using volley fire, they start firing at will, or they start shooting individual targets. Each person shoots at their own pace, at their own target, and this is actually where we see a lot of the devastation happen in the medieval battles. It wasn't always the long range of volleys. That was kind of like the harassment that caused battlefield morale to drop and formations to lose cohesion. But at close distances, that's when the longbows really ripped up the enemy. They could shoot fairly quickly. Again, you have 5 rounds per minute or 6 shots per minute, so every 5 or 6 seconds you have an arrow loose from a bow. When you have a few hundred do that, it's a constant shower of arrows, and that would be enough to break an infantry formation. So with compound, if they get close enough, they're not going to shoot fast enough. The longbowmen, even if they take casualties by compound accuracy, they're going to keep on unleashing it. They go from artillery to machine gun. So you have the compound, which is the rifleman. So they're good at a long to mid distance. But you have surprisingly a more flexible medieval formation, which at long range would be artillery, and at close range would be a machine gun. So I think that if you have the compound bow, this is going back to the point here. The compound bow has this gap where if you sit in this distance, you can avoid some of the volley fire, and we can return fire with very good accuracy. If you stay at long distance, then they can't really shoot that effectively. It goes beyond the effective range of accurate compound fire, whereas the longbows don't have to aim, they're shooting at an area target, something which compound shooters generally aren't very good at. But when you go to extremely close quarters, the compound shooters lose that advantage of being in mid-range, and they're now facing a superior rate of fire from people who don't have to aim at point targets. All they have to do is hit a man-sized target at 30 meters. And most of us who are bad shooters can hit a target at 30 meters. So I think we have an interesting back and forth here, depending on how it's done. So just to summarize, again, I'm going off my notes here. To summarize, the advantages of a medieval longbow formation would be longer effective range for indirect fire. You have a greater volume of fire. And at close distances, you have superior rate of fire, which means that they can probably devastate enemy formations at close distance and long distance. At mid distance, what will often happen is that the modern archer will have a higher first hit probability, and they can pick off individual targets. So not aiming at a general area or a mass of bodies, they're aiming at specific targets, very much like riflemen or light infantry during the gunpowder era. Sorry. Now, again, they can hit this sort of target at 50 meters nearly 100% of the time. So that's going to be a smaller than man-sized target. You're aiming at a heart here, and if you miss the heart, you hit something else. So I think that's the situation there. Now, I think to really summarize the point here, overall, if the more this becomes a battlefield scenario, the more likely the medieval archers will win. Again, you have the robustness of the bows, you have the training, you have the flexibility of having mobile formations. Whereas if this becomes an individual or a skirmish or an ambush scenario, then the compound bows have an advantage. In many ways, if this was to be a realistic clash, let's say a long campaign where they're trying to eliminate each other, then the medieval archers would probably more likely to force a pitched battle where they can stay in a defensive formation, move every now and then, but keep on volleying fire and shifting their the base of fire so that they have a beaten zone. The compound shooters, the modern compound shooters, would operate very much like light infantry or special forces, where you have smaller groups of marksmen that can pick off targets at distance and disappear and avoid return fire. It's a very this is why I think it's my favorite matchup, or the favorite scenario is realistically 300 compound shooters would not shoot together. They'll probably have like 30 10-man teams or 65-man teams, or basically sniper teams, just be irregular warfare. So you have 2 or 3 marksmen working together, or wolf packs working together and just picking off enemies, whereas the medieval archers cannot match that against a modern compound shooter. But if they fought in battle, then the compound shooters would collapse. They would not be able to sustain that amount of incoming fire from the longbow formations, and that's when we'll see that collapse. Now, I have one more twist to this. The twist is that if we were to have multiple rounds with replacement archers, then what you'll see is the modern compound will come out on top. Why? Because it is much easier for someone to learn to shoot compound and shoot accurately with compound than a longbowman. A medieval archer required a lifetime of specialized training to become proficient, and this is the reason why guns were popularized. By the time you reach the Napoleonic era, they didn't have any more longbowmen. Even if they wanted to have longbows against the gunpowder units, they couldn't. The amount of wars fought, let's say in the 100 Years' War, they lost so many of their archers that they couldn't raise another battalion of archers. You just couldn't do so. I mean, if you can't just order archers like that. Like you couldn't just like put it on a queue and recruit it for 100 gold. You had to say, all right, you need like 5 years or 10 years of training to produce archers. This was a standing force. And again, in England, they required the population to train so they could draw on a ready body of new archers for every war. And the longer this would go on, then the fewer people in that pool could be used as archers, and you start getting a drop in quality. This is one of the reasons why the longbowmen in England were starting to lose battles. Sure, you had Cressy, you had Poitiers, you had Agincourt, but by the time you reach the last few conflicts in the 100 Years' War, the English weren't that scary anymore. The archers weren't well trained. They were starting to lose against more mobile formations and all that sort of thing. So yeah, like you would experience a huge drop. Whereas with compound Compound was like a rifle. You show someone how to use it, and they'll shoot accurate with it within a few weeks, if not a few months. That's the advantage. So I think that's an interesting twist there. So overall, my evaluation: who would win? As of anyone saying this, it strongly depends on the scenario, but it's not a one-sided battle. And I think if we were to portray this in a dynamic campaign with pitch battles and ambushes and skirmishes, then I think overall a modern compound bow with modern style techniques and tactics would win the overall war. If this was a single pitch battle, if this was the totally realistic battle simulator, and you had compounds and you had longbows, then the longbows would probably win in the end. But if this was an evolving war where there were pitch battles and different skirmishes, then a small group of compound shooters can do more damage against a bigger group of longbows, and they will probably win through a modern application of what is basically guerrilla warfare. And this is what the special forces do around the world. So that, I think, concludes my assessment of the matchup. I think it's a very interesting matchup, and I think the way we approach this can be, I mean, you can feel free to disagree with me, by the way. This is the whole point of the live chat and the questions. If you have any other things to point out, then it'd be worth mentioning. So if you have any extra comments, questions, or you want to challenge what I've said, post it in the comments right now, or the chat right now. Highlight my name if you want to draw my attention. I'll see the big orange mark on my screen. But I think that is going to be my personal opinion, my assessment. Again, I'm not making this about soldiers versus civilians. I'm assuming this is going to be a competition between modern equipment and medieval equipment. Again, I'm specifying longbows as the medieval archetype and compound bows as the modern archetype, just to show that polarization and the better extremes of archery technology and technique over centuries. And for those just joining me now, again, my opinion overall is that I think the compound bow actually has a lot of edges over the medieval bows, but the medieval bow is more appropriate for the battlefield for a reason. It was designed for the battlefield. The compound bow was more designed for a single hunting shot or a long archery tournament. So I think the battlefield situations will see a big change in terms of usage. I think overall, if the compound bow plays to its strengths, it will win against the longbowmen by sheer accuracy and the ability to hit a target with high certainty, whereas the longbowmen would have more of an erratic shot result, and the closer they go, then the more likely they are to reach the same level of lethality. But that's not guaranteed. If the compound shooter doesn't allow that to happen, then if the battle stays at range, then the compound has an edge. But it has to be a very short and decisive battle for the longbows to win. If this becomes guerrilla, then the compounds, they're not matched. They basically are assassins. That was the bonus question, the thread. What if they become assassins? Assassins are assassins. The tool they use doesn't matter. But the reality is, if you have the ability to kill, then the compound bow is, if you weren't facing things like guns, then compound bows would be the top edge of military hardware, especially if you use compound crossbows. That's the ultimate edge. But we're not talking about crossbows, we're talking about compounds only. Okay, so let's go through our questions and comments. That was about a 40-minute spiel, I think. Yes, it was. So let's see what people have to say. Again, feel free to jump in and post comments, because this is my live stream for a reason. That's a lot of talk, by the way. Good stuff, guys. Alright, okay, let's have a quick look here. Just skimming through. Let's have a look. Yeah, what is the draw weight on the mini compound? Yeah, I'll show you the mini compound again. So this is the cartel mini compound. I have reviewed this already, by the way. It's the one compound review I have on my channel. So this is the cartel mini compound. It comes in like 3 colors. It comes in blue, red, and green, and it comes with stabilizers. You actually see there is a stabilizer mount here. It comes with stabilizers. It comes with 3 arrows. Watch my review. I do shoot with it in my house, and it's a grouping like this. This is actually not a toy. It's meant to be a desktop ornament, but it is a serious projectile. I actually want to shoot a test tournament with this, like a 10-meter tournament, to see if we can actually shoot well with this. But it can be dangerous. It is definitely a viable bow. I believe this is 12 pounds of draw weight. So it works. Ugh. It has the let off, so it's not to demonstrate this, and it can be shot. My arrows are somewhere else. I have no target here, so I can't shoot it. But yes, this is a real bow that can be shot properly. So that's I think a 12-pound mini compound. All right, last question. That was from that was a laugh, I think. That was from Pacific Hunter. So yeah, glad you can see that. I've got too much stuff lying around. All right, we'll chuck it down there. All right. Where was I? Let's see, other questions. That's up for me. Oh yes, Cartman Ada. What does the Coca-Cola taste like? For those who missed my last stream, this is... Where's my bottle? This is Coke, obviously. This is coffee Coke. It's something you find in Australia right now. And I think Japan has it too. It's Coke with coffee in it. I don't like it that much. It's kind of fat now too. It's been 2 days, but it's basically the taste of Coke, but it has the aftertaste of a black coffee. It's actually not bad. I mean, it's something which, it's a mature taste. You can probably acquire it after a while, but like I said last night, it's not why I drink Coke. I want Coke to be a little sweet and a little kind of like, you know, that burn in your throat, but having a coffee taste doesn't make sense to me. I'd rather drink a coffee, honestly, rather than a Coke and coffee. But it's interesting, and maybe you see it in your area at some point. Hi, Bullets 4 Teeth, new sub, welcome to the channel, hope you enjoy. Crunchy Noodle 321, how long should I wait before purchasing a bow after first starting? That's a good question. I would recommend probably 4 to 8 weeks. Because first you want to see if you want to stay with archery. Many people want to try just for a day or two or session or two, and they don't necessarily want to stay with the sport forever, so they don't need to buy a bow. The reason why you want to wait for longer is if you are researching bows, like what kind of bow do you want. I think like your first 4 sessions might not be enough time to say I want a compound bow or I want to shoot an Olympic recurve. So I recommend 4 to 8 weeks, that's 1 to 2 months, before you start thinking about buying a bow. After that, it's probably good timing. The sooner you buy your own equipment, the better. And the reason is that if you're looking at a club, the club bows are generic, and often they're mismatched because we have to make use of spare arrows and spare parts. So there's a limit to what you can learn with a club bow, and most clubs will encourage you to buy your own gear when you're ready and when you're willing to spend money on a bow. The sooner you own one, the sooner you start personalizing your gear, and the faster you progress, or the sooner you progress, because it's no longer the equipment that's holding you back, it is now definitely you. So club equipment does have a limit, and often there are points where you're not sure whether it's you or the bow, and we probably know it's the bow. There's a point you can basically max out on your club bow. The sooner the better, but don't rush the process. So I recommend 4 to 8 weeks. Bullets fortooth. Well, they were using crossbows back then, were they not? Yes. I mean, it was only really in England that the longbow surpassed the crossbow. The crossbows were more used in Western Europe. So looking at France and Germany and especially Italy, some of the Italian crossbowmen were very well known, like the Genoese. They were mostly used as mercenaries. In the east, you see more along the lines of, again, horse archers and foot archers again. But we're talking about archer formations rather than crossbowmen. So if you use crossbows, that's an interesting battle, like crossbowmen versus compound bowmen. Compound would okay, compound would win actually, because like what I said before with medieval longbows is that they have a faster rate of fire, and they can be shot with more intuition, so it's first shot accuracy. Whereas compound bows are slow in aim but will hit the target. A crossbow, a medieval crossbow, would have very strong power. They can punch through armor, and they could be accurate to a distance, but they would not be able to compete with compound. So compound would actually shoot faster and more accurately, whereas crossbows would shoot slower and less accurately, but have more power. And that's not going to work against compound shooters. So that's an easy battle actually. That's going to be an interesting thing. All right. Lisa White, mentally imagining 300 modern shooters basically pissing themselves as soon as battle starts. Yeah, that wouldn't be a win. I mean, one of the things with this matchup is that you can't really measure the psychology of the person as much. When you see an actual volley of arrows hitting your way, that in itself is quite scary. Whereas you won't actually see a volley of compound arrows. But like I said before, you will see the front rank of your longbow compatriots drop dead or drop to the ground with an arrow stuck in their rib cage. Or their neck. So that's insane actually. So that's a very interesting thing, is what will it look like. Let's see, other questions. Cornelius McMuffin, what about armor? That's where things get, again, I do want to factor in armor because that really complicates the equation. This isn't like the Deadliest Warrior, you have this really fake computer program where you insert these parameters. Armor is very interesting because armor blocks arrows. That's why I didn't say armor, because arrows generally aren't good against armor. Again, mail and gambeson, which would be very common with medieval armies, would be very hard to penetrate at long distance. A lot of the testing done is at very short distance, but in combat distances, it's probably going to block most arrows. And most of the hits were probably in the unprotected areas. The face, the neck, the legs, or the hands, perhaps. So, yeah, like the part of the advantage of volley fire is that something will hit something. An arrow will hit somebody, it will hit some kind of open section. So, yeah, armor, you have to bypass armor. You can't really punch through armor. And modern armor depends on what armor you're using. If you're using like something like Kevlar, then yeah, I don't think arrows will go through, especially when you have an underlay beneath. Because the thing with armor is that you need layers. If you only shoot at mail, the mail itself will actually block a lot of arrows, because it's not like a giant ring thing that Hollywood uses when you just poke a chopstick through it. Good mail, high quality mail, is very dense. So there's very few openings. You can't poke an arrow through an opening in a ring. It doesn't work that way. But even if you could penetrate, it's always worn with gambeson or linen or something underneath, some kind of padded armor underneath. So if you could penetrate the steel mail, then you're not going to punch through the cloth underneath. There are lots of testing that shows this. Check out Thane Thrand. He does a lot of demonstration with swords and spears and pillar or arrows every now and then. But yeah, it's armor really complicates things. I'd say in general that arrows, for the most part, would not defeat armor. Crossbows would be, except you have a very, very strong shot in a crossbow that could punch through steel. But a modern carbon arrow would probably shatter against steel. Like modern arrows aren't designed for armor. I would not recommend it. But yeah, I'm assuming that you have to bypass armor rather than beat armor. That's where I think I differ from many people. A lot of people will kind of talk about armor and how arrows can or can't penetrate. I'm going to assume that armor you want to avoid in general. Okay. Most of these questions are for me too. Scanning through. I think we're reaching the end here. I think. Oh, Lisa makes a good point here. So a while ago I mentioned like the idea of special forces or wolf packs, and Lisa points out that that wouldn't really be effective in medieval battlefields. In medieval times, rather than a battlefield, you wouldn't have a wolf pack in a battlefield. You want cohesion in a battlefield, not like individual units in the round thing. That you want some guys together doing a thing. But I guess with I mean, while a formation of archers is flexible, a formation of compound bowmen could break up the smaller unit and still be effective. So you can have the same effectiveness with a smaller unit. And if you're fighting in a protracted campaign where you are trying to raid and ambush, then I think the compounds have a big advantage. And something I didn't mention, but I think someone mentioned here as well, I think Bullets 40th mentioned this, is that the compound bow is actually a much smaller bow, so you can actually shoot while kneeling, you can shoot while in a tree, and it's actually much better in a forest, surprisingly, because it's designed, especially the hunting ones, they're designed to be shot from cramped positions. So they have a lot of tactical advantages. Strategic ones, not so much, but tactical ones, there is a lot of things. Let's see. Obelix, CMM. By the way, I love Asterix. I'm seeing Obelix's icon here. It's the blue and white striped trousers is lovely. Don't you think compound shooters would adjust to long range and group shooting? Depends on how you train them. Could you get a lot of compound bowmen to shoot in volleys? Yes, you could perhaps. But you can't sight for a volley shot. A volley shot, you need to gauge by the fall of the shot. You can't really say, all right, sight for 200 meters, because again, you're not artillery. You're a sniper. Imagine like a bunch of snipers firing in volley. Or more realistically, if you have like a rifleman, light infantry in the musket era shooting in volleys, that's not what they're really good for. They're good for picking off individual targets. So while the muskets will be firing in volleys, the riflemen are picking off officers, and that's what I think the compound bow will be used for. You might have some people, like a rifle team, you might have some people maintaining a stream of fire, but I think you have a number of people who act like designated marksmen. I think that would be the more realistic thing. I doubt that a compound formation would shoot in volleys at long range. I don't think the best use of compound. Interesting question though. If you did, it'd be quite interesting. Greg Barker as an active comment here, the effective range for the English warbow was approximately 200 meters. That sounds about right. And the longbowman would have 2 arrows in the air before the compound ever drew the bow. I agree with that. Yes, that would be the norm. By the time the compound archer would knock an arrow and draw, the English longbows would probably have shot 2 or 3 arrows in the air. So again, they have a very big first shot advantage. And I don't think there'd be any way for a compound to beat that. Even if they had already knocked there, the longbows will have a first shot. Always a big advantage there. Alright. Iron Pirate. Longbow would be easier to shoot under pressure being shot at. Yeah, I agree. Again, with the compound bow, there are more. It's more of a fine thing. Unless you build a compound that is military grade, that is easy to load and shoot, then you're not gonna have the same resilience and robustness. Hence why I said robustness is a big thing. Longbows basically you pull back and shoot. So if you see people around you being shot, you can still shoot. Whereas compound, it's more sensitive to mistakes. So if you punch the trigger, or you're panicking, or you flinch, then your arrow's going to go way off. That said, an error with a compound bow will probably still hit something. So that's one advantage and one disadvantage. Let's see. What do we have? I just missed a few lines. There we go. Back to me. All right, back to me. Sorry, I skipped like 10 pages there. All right. Iron Pirate. Are there? Sorry, I'm seeing some weird things here in chat. Keep it nice, guys, by the way. I have no moderators. I'm doing myself, but if people aren't treated nicely, then I'm going to have to start blocking people. That's not very nice. Northy, Warbow. That's my phone going off there. Warbow have arrows like broom handles. Yeah, that it'll look right scary. Like you can probably hear it coming. Yeah, the fact that you hear like large feathers ruffling and arrows coming down would be kind of scary. Iron Pirate again. Are the compound bows designed for tactical use? No. As far as I know, no. The most practical ones would be the hunting ones. I don't think there are tactical compounds. You see them in games, like I think Crisis is the best example of a tactical compound. I don't think there is a tactical compound. You will see tactical compound crossbows because they're basically just rifles with a stock and a crossbow instead. But you won't find tactical compounds. There's no demand for it. If there's no demand, then there's no need. Oblique's modern compound bow can be shot faster with the Anita bows. You can shoot all compounds without release aid. It's just safer and more accurate to have a release aid. So I guess if a compound shooter was really desperate, then they would drop the release aid and just shoot with their fingers and it'd be just fine. That's one thing. Hey, that's not very nice. We'll have to ban some people now. It's been unfortunate, but gotta keep it nice, guys. Okay. Santi, did I touch upon medieval recurve for short bows? I didn't mention them specifically, and the reason being, like I said at the beginning, the medieval era is a very long period, and there's so much diversity in bows that it's kind of hard to say one kind of medieval archer. So I went for the archetype that most people are familiar with. That's the English longbow. But again, if you choose horse bows or short bows or recurve bows, that's kind of a bit different there. But I think the idea of having formations shooting against each other will still apply in a similar way. I think the shorter bows, and especially the more dynamic mobile styles of archery, would have a slight edge, well actually would have a more of an edge in close quarters, but I think the mid-range will still be dominated by compound. Crazy Zuka, what do you think about homemade PVC bows to start a bow? I don't have personal experience. I know someone who has a PVC bow. If you want to experiment with shooting a bow, then PVC is good. If you want to get an experience of archery as an actual hobby or sport, then I don't think it's as satisfying. The part of PVC is the whole do-yourself experience. The fact that you can make a functional bow using PVC and whatever other items you use is, I think that's half the satisfaction. If you start thinking about like whether is it good for archery, it's not really good for archery. It's just nice to shoot. Northy, yeah, club bows are nasty, yeah. I mean, even with the good clubs with well-stocked equipment, like eventually you have to replace things. So they're good enough to get started, not really good for long-term learning. Greg Barker again. I feel that medieval archers were more accurate than you are giving them credit for. And I feel the longbow rate of fire would decimate the compound bow force. I think rate of fire is going to be a huge tilt factor. I agree with it actually. Yeah, rate of fire is going to be huge. Am I giving them less credit for accuracy? Look, compared to a compound, it's no match. But I think the factor is in practical situations, in battlefield situations, longbows or medieval archers were accurate enough. So as long as you have, I think that either you volley and you generally hit an area and decimate people through a continuous barrage, or a close range where you can pick your target. Yes, I feel that if you talk about individual target selection and point aiming, then the compound shooter can do so at a much further distance than a medieval shooter. A medieval shooter can shoot accurately, but not to the same distance as a compound shooter. So there's a bit of a I guess a gap there. If they're both shooting at each other at the same distance, let's say a 40 meters or 50 meters, then I think the medieval archer has a slight edge with rate of fire, but the compound shooter has a slight edge with accuracy. Crunchy Noodle, would it be unusual if the limbs I bought were different brand to the riser? That's normal. Most people do that. Very few people actually buy like the same brand, because often you have a good riser, but you have cheap limbs because you want to dispose of the limbs at some point. So yeah, that's normal. Nothing wrong with that as long as they're compatible. 8-bit archer. How heavy are we talking about with compound arrows? I'm not really using a weight in my mind here. I'm just gonna go with compound arrows. Depends. Like I'm sure, like whoever's like, if there's an army of compound archers, they'll probably have a selection of different arrows, different purposes. There wouldn't be just one arrow for everybody. So I'm not gonna make a comment about that one. Anti Lawrence, longbow versus musket. That's an interesting one. Just missed a few things here. Sorry, just following along. Yeah, Thane Thran I mentioned before. Alright, and I think I've reached the end of chat there, and that is it. So thank you for joining me. This was a long video, but this was an interesting thing. I'll ask Sinas to stop spamming me. I do appreciate your recommendation, but I know Jimmy Ellis, he doesn't like me at all, and I don't intend to follow him, but we'll leave it there. So thank you for watching. I hope this was an interesting video. I might follow up with another short one on if we were to replace all medieval archers with modern compound bows, what would happen? I'll save that for a different video perhaps, but I think this one was an interesting matchup. So hopefully you found this stream interesting, and thank you for the questions and comments. And if you have further comments, feel free to post in the comments below once this video goes on the VOD list. So thanks guys, that was an interesting discussion. Hope that was interesting to you. This is New Sensei, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.